our scientific writing workshop. So we're very happy to have a couple of half-day workshops like this in addition to our usual 2.5-day sessions at the Institute. If this is your first session joining us, we have the Wi-Fi over here. It's NU-Wave guest with this guest name and password. You should have received links to join Piazza, where we post links to all of the material, in addition to a link to Google Drive, where most of the material is posted. Although I think for this particular session, we have actual printouts. So you should have received those. If not, I'll hand some of these out to you if you haven't received one already. So I'm very happy to introduce Alicia Williams, who will be leading this workshop. So Alicia is coming to us from Rutgers University, where she is a postdoctoral teaching fellow in English language and literature, although she has a background in chemistry as well. So thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, Kylie. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me well? Is this a good volume?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I'm happy to be here as well. As Kylie said, my name is Alicia. This will be a discussion-based workshop, so I'll be talking, you'll also be talking. I think we'll proceed as follows, because we have the half-an-hour break in the middle. First, we'll talk a bit about writing and vocabulary for writing and scientific writing in particular. Then we'll have time to do one or two of the examples that were circulated. The sheet that got passed around is just a different version where they're extracted from the articles that they came from. So because it's a revision-based workshop, we'll be talking not about composing writing, not about getting started, but like, let's say the research went really well and it's time to write the article. We'll be acting as if you're at the level of having some sort of draft that you'll be working with. But we'll be using the revisions in order to talk about principles to good scientific writing that I hope are simple enough to think about internalizing, even as we get into the nitty-gritty of language. Yes, go ahead. There'll be time to pass this out as well if you haven't gotten a sheet. Does that make sense? And we'll, of course, have time, I hope, to talk about composing writing and getting started if people want to at the end. That's primarily a revision-based workshop. So what we should do first is come to some sort of consensus about what you understand good, effective, well-composed scientific writing to look like. Go ahead. Feel free to discuss it anytime. What would you say characterizes good scientific writing? Go ahead.
Concise.
Concise? Concision, yes. Excellent.
Comprehensibility.
Comprehensibility? Easy to understand? Yes? Well structured? Yes, excellent. You can say that about sentences, and you can say that over the, there's a microstructure to the sentence, and there's a macrostructure to the article. Go ahead.
Correctness of grammar.
Correct grammar, yes. That is important, especially when you send it off to peer reviewers. If the grammar looks clean, then they might assume the science is clean, or they at least won't assume the opposite.
Do supporting tables and graphs count in here as well?
Yes, yes. Although we won't be talking too much about the actual composition of the tables or the figures, but the captions.
Good use of those tools.
Ah, yes, yes, yes. Well employed,
Right.
well composed, yeah.
Proper citation.
Proper citation, yes. Both of those things I think are actually issues that are the sequence of the figures and tables matters if you're thinking about how to articulate the research project, like the order, the sequence. On citation, it's not just that you know the style, the ACS style, or whatever style you're trying to employ, but that you know how to paraphrase, what's worth paraphrasing, that you're working with recent sources, but also seminal sources on that concept or on that project or method or whatever it may be. So both small things like getting the citation right, and then also appropriate citation, like understanding how to paraphrase well and insert yourself in that kind of research endeavor program. In terms of style, I heard concise and comprehensible. Any other stylistic matters that people have thoughts about? Go ahead.
Fluidity.
Sorry?
Fluidity.
Fluidity. Oh, like a nice flow to the structure. Kyle?
appropriateness for the audience, for the reader?
Uh-huh. Yeah. What would you say goes into that kind of appropriateness?
Well, if you're writing, so like I'm from a computational lab, but we have obviously have a lot of applications in biomedical applications and biology and chemistry and things like that. So whether we're writing for a more computational audience or a more life scientist audience, whether we're writing for experts in those fields or more at a higher level for a general audience, things like that, we write very differently in those different situations.
That will also include the kind of chart or paper is being submitted to. What are their requirements?
Right, right. And what would their expectations about their audience be? Is it like a hyper-specialized journal, or say Nature, where you want to speak to a broad audience because your implications would be so broadly appreciated? That, I think, comes down to comprehensibility and concision, although I think sometimes there's a tendency when you feel that you are writing a much more specialized, kind of project, that the vocabulary can end up also becoming more specialized and becoming more difficult for even the audience that you think you are trying to talk to. And that's especially, I think, one place where that becomes very clear is when, say, you're writing to a rather specific audience, but there's easy adjacent audiences, like, say, computation for mass spec. You might have two different audiences in mind. You want it to be clear, you want your writing to be clear to the adjacent audience. I think often it's less clear than you would think. Did people find the samples for, if you read the samples for today, did you find them quite clear? Okay, we'll get to the examples. But I thought they were good. We'll get there. But if you found them clear, I would agree. But so I've found some other examples that are maybe less clear that will make the point a little bit sharper. Okay. How often do you have this kind of discussion about what makes good science writing, effective science writing? Not so often? Once a semester? Once per lab meeting? Is that too generous? Is today the first time? Okay. That's a good reminder, because I do want to say, if I ever go far into some vocabulary about grammar or writing and I've lost you, please stop me and remind me. Does everyone have a working knowledge of subject-verb in a sentence? The subject performs the action of the sentence. The action is captured in the verb. That's where I want everyone to sort of start with when we get to the examples. But as we might get ever so slightly more granular than subject-verb towards the end, and do stop me if we need to go over something again. Okay. So there is information out there, even if you're not talking about it often in your lab, about how to write a good manuscript paper. This is a digest of 20 editorials on how to write a good scientific manuscript that came out a couple of years ago. It's not published by ACS, but its editors are part of ACS journals. These are some of the things. It's okay if you can't quite see them all, because I picked out a few that stood out to me. Creative, these are the sort of descriptors that are something to strive for, but maybe not obvious or clear how you would go about writing, for example, good background and motivation, or healthy scientific discussion, quantitative analysis, or model, or mechanistic scheme to explain the results. Even less clear to me would be how to just raise some degree of curiosity in the last paragraph of the introduction on command. Are these legible to you, these kinds of adjectives or descriptors?
It's like you know it when you see it, but
Right, but how to go about...
I would know if they raise curiosity, but I don't know necessarily that I am capable of performing that.
Right, exactly, yes. So there's a sense of, you want concision and you want comprehensibility, but to actually go about doing that, that's the question. When I work with graduate students, I sometimes get the impression in the sciences and STEM, but even in other fields as well, that there's, you're so busy already with your research. You don't always get to practice writing as much as you might like. And therefore, this sense that there's something mysterious about becoming a good writer. Like at this point in your career, you might just be one, or you might not be one. I'm a bad writer, or I'm a good writer. And oftentimes, it's slightly more towards the negative. I don't mean to be a motivational speaker, but I do feel very, I'm excited about writing, so I hope that you walk away with a more positive attitude about writing. But my thinking is that you don't necessarily want to become a good writer, but just understand yourself to be an always improving writer. And the process of improvement is not mysterious, but in fact, at least in my thinking, there's some structural principles that you can work on that demystify that process, so that make it so that you might have enough command over your writing to raise curiosity at the end of an introduction, and speak to a broad audience outside of your specialized vocabulary, even as you're trying to sound so smart and professionalized in that specialty. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm positive, but we're going to wade a little bit through the negative. This is from a piece called The Development of Scientific Communication Skills that I was intrigued by, so I'd love for you to confirm or deny if this is your experience as well. You don't need to talk necessarily personal experience, but in the theoretical or in the abstract, if that's more comfortable. These authors did a qualitative study interviewing trainees and interviewing their mentors about how scientific communication gets taught. Some of these descriptors feel like they're part of the sort of apprenticeship model, like you're just supposed to kind of figure this out. And writing, in the absence of specific conversations about scientific writing, can also work that way. You know, you're just supposed to sort of figure it out, infer from the track changes that you're receiving and the comments how to be better. So this is just the population of their study. I mean, I understand that we have some statisticians in the room, so you can give feedback on whether or not these kinds of inferences that the authors draw us make sense. It was done at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in 2010. The population is classed as broken down to men and women, English language learners, which is signified by L2 here, and native English speakers, L1, as well as underrepresented minorities in the sciences. So this is what they found. They tabulated representative quotations that fell along different kinds of themes. So this theme is self-confidence and interest in developing scientific communication skills. You can see that there's some confirmation. My scientific writing is bad. You know, that this is not to say that these are anonymized, so it's not that that quote matched up with that mentor. But in some level, there's confirmation that the mentors felt that there were feelings of inferiority or inferior writing skills among the trainees. At the same time, there was also some sense that the trainees were defensive and felt that their writing was already good enough on some level, why work on it? Or, if they were weak, at least to somehow resist acknowledging that kind of weakness. This is the question of the broad audience. One trainee, it depends on the audience. If the audience has a statistics background, then I'm okay. If they do not, or if they have a biology or chemistry background, then I'm not okay. To me, that kind of comment suggests, this is my inference from these quotes, that they do understand the importance of they do understand the importance of writing well. If you understand that you're supposed to be writing to a broad audience, I think on some level you're understanding the importance. Even more so the woman who was considering a career in academia, but given her writing skills, is reconsidering that option. So that trainee, to me, does have an appreciation of the importance of scientific writing to their career. You can see that the major finding is that there was a lot of distress and a lot of miscommunication or lack of mutual understanding. Some of the other findings, if you're interested in these breakdowns, L1 males, so native speaker males, had the highest confidence in their writing. L1 females had the lowest confidence in their writing, lower than both L2 females and L1 males, L2 males. The mentors, however, did not remark on these aspects of writing or developing communication, their attitudes towards them, making any distinctions among these categories of trainees. So they saw it to be a comprehensive, across-the-board kind of problem. Okay, so here's the theme, degree of mentor involvement in teaching scientific communication skills. What struck me here, again, these are my inferences, is that there's an intense imbalance in the number of comments students had to say, or trainees, I should say, had to say. They counted both graduate students and postdocs, compared to the number of comments mentors had to say about involving themselves in developing their students or their trainees' scientific communication skills. Does this square with people's experience? Again, you don't have to speak like personally, but is this your general understanding about the way developing scientific communication skills works? Kind of haphazardly and with some miscommunication along the way. Go ahead. Or no?
And I guess the only time I get feedback is when my project sends back comments. That's the only time I get.
And the comments are partly on the writing or also on content?
Well, or usually it's not even comments, it's changes. But
Oh, track changes.
yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it was a learning curve. So from my first paper, it went through like more than 20 iterations between me and my advisor. Coming to the most recent one, it was just like 2 or 3 iterations before it went to. So there's a steep learning curve. So when you compare the first draft and the most final draft, you can see how much difference is there in the language and writing style.
I think it would be a case of doing well and receiving feedback, and like taking on the feedback.
Yeah, my advisor was not very pushy in that one, but he used to say like when it reached like the 15th iteration, he was like fed up saying that, yeah. But then you could see that actually, if you take the first draft and the last report that goes to the journal, you can see how much more sense it makes when you do that.
Yeah.
Because when you're starting the writing, it's more like you're writing like an essay or something like that, and then it's more like how you're writing a novel or writing not like writing a school article or something like that compared to actual scientific. So,
A scientific article for publication. I mean, this is a mix of comments. There's a lot of positive comments, like my mentor does give a good job giving feedback, or at least I see the logic of their changes. And then some sort of, it's not that it's bad help, but that it's a lack of conversation or a lack of help, or that there's not an importance placed on writing specifically. And then among the trainees, the mentors, there's a feeling of, this is not my job. I have a PhD or MD PhD in a field that is not writing. So part of today is just developing a vocabulary so that when you find yourself trying to infer from the track changes or in a collaborative writing session, how to describe what it is that's working well in the writing and how to describe what's working not so well or ineffectively in the writing. Or maybe just to realize that you do need to have communication skills about communication skills in order to improve. Or that might speed up the process. When I was at the last scientific workshop I did, it was like a week long and we went on hikes and there was lots of time to talk to the graduate students in the room, and they would say things like, and then I was saying, I'm doing the writing workshop, like what are your feelings about writing? From their perspective, they accepted the changes rapid fire. My mentor sends over the changes, I just accept, going down the Word document. At the speakers' dinner, there was conversation about how you can see the timestamp and students just accept the changes without necessarily thinking about what the logic behind the changes was. So the aim is to get on the same page, so to speak. I think this is the last, I was just intrigued by their numbers of tabulations. This is the last section. Trainees' response to mentors' feedback. So how do you accept feedback well? How do you take feedback, whether it's like delivered positively or vaguely or maybe not so positively? This was my sort of sense of the spectrum that they were getting at. In the best case scenario, it's not clear, it's not easy to understand the mentor's feedback. In the worst case scenario, it's a devastating moment to have to see the comments on draft 1, for example. From the mentor's perspective, the best case scenario was they were concerned about how the students felt about receiving bad comments. Ultimately, the process was tiring or frustrating. Does this resonate? Go ahead.
I consult with a lot of graduate students, so without saying anything about people's commenting on my writing, I see this relationship played out quite often, and it really feels like it depends on so many variables. A lot of times it's how the relationship between the mentor and the student is going in the first place. Like I see a lot more red when the mentor is really irritated by the student than when it's not. sounds silly and maybe self-evident, but it's actually a thing. Like, they're not necessarily on writing, or they are, but there's just an antagonistic relationship. So of course these students feel bad, that they were going to feel bad no matter what. The other thing is that the assumption is that the mentor really is a good, strong writer themselves, which is not always the case. And so when you get feedback like this from somebody, I mean, what I've seen is pay attention to it, because sometimes not very good feedback.
That's a lot to think about. People have thoughts about that. I mean, I wonder, it definitely does depend on personalities, and to a certain extent, there might be something the compatibility can't be altered or reversed if you go past a certain point. But in the ideal scenario, at least when it comes to writing, you would show that you're working on improving your writing, and that you demonstrate that rather than being resistant to feedback, even if it is kind of devastating. Like, that's the experience that people go through, but everybody's going through it. The less, I hesitate, in the bounds of normalcy, the less resistance you show to accepting feedback, I think the better the compatibility might be. Therefore, the better the working relationship over writing and the science you're doing might be. With the caveat of you don't want to end up in some sort of traumatic relationship where it's unhealthy to an extent, like how much you have to, efface yourself in order to please an advisor.
Everybody should be able to rise above this. Like, you weren't in love with your student, you should be able to give them quality feedback on their writing. You aren't in love with your advisor, you should be able to accept that they're trying to help you.
Indeed.
I mean, you should be adults about it, but not everybody actually delivers.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, yes. So this is what I think, partly there's a couple caveats to the examples that we'll be looking at in that they did make it to publication. So keep that in mind. We have not only the goal to just get along with your advisor or have some more developed vocabulary about writing, but when you model your work off of your advisor's writing or accept their feedback as a given, if their writing itself is not amazingly strong or the best model that you want to follow, you might end up modeling yourself after not the most expert version of writing that you could, that is out there in the field, because there's a mix out there in the published research. So keep this in mind, that we're looking at published examples. They've made it to some extent, and yet we're still going to work on revising them for improvement. That's the idea, that there's a higher goal even among the published literature, which is to make scientific writing more readable. One definition of bad scientific writing or ineffective scientific writing might be that you have to read it every sentence, or you have to read that sentence a couple times before you can understand it. So thinking about your audience and making the writing comprehensible to your audience, but also exciting and engaging. Clarity, concision, that is one thing, but you can be clear and concise while also being a bit boring or dry. And so the ultimate goal is not just to write clearly and concisely, but to engage your audience and make them want to keep reading the paper. Wherever they start in your paper, the title, the abstract, and the figure captions, you want them to go to the introduction and continue reading. Even more so with a grant or a letter to a collaborator, or whatever it may be, to engage your audience. That would be the ultimate goal. One thing that we didn't talk a lot about, but that I often hear about, is the story aspect. That is what I'm talking about when I say you want to make your reader keep reading. Partly, I think, although this is easier described than done, it registers on the sentence level. So that's what we'll get to when we get to the examples. This is the first one from Mina's paper. It should be the first one on the sheet, which I have more of if people came in late. Anybody? Oh, go ahead. So let's see. First of all, for this one, I'll admit that I ended up making the most minor edits, because this is a pretty good sentence. But I was looking for problems that recur. Anyone else? Yes, let me say thank you to Olga's group, first for inviting me, but second for supplying these papers. They didn't want me to circulate other people's writing as examples of bad writing. But I found the articles well written. So I imagine the homework, if you did it, was either very easy because you made minor changes, or very hard because you were thinking, what could I possibly change? It looks quite good. So this is, we'll get to we'll kind of like route through other examples that make the point a little more crisply because they have more to work on. In fact, this one is in front of you, but if you really have the quickest edit for this one, I'll give you this second one. This one requires a little more thinking, I would say. But there's a pattern that we'll ultimately arrive at. So I would say work with the people around you, or show them what you brought if you brought a revised example, and then we'll check back in. That's how we'll proceed. This is like our beginning of the workshop moment. Does it make sense? If you've already revised the one Mina's paper, then talk about your revision with your neighbors, or review it to yourself if you'd rather work alone. And if you already have it all squared away, you would say, take a look at this one and see how you would revise this sentence. I'll give you a couple minutes, so take your time, but I'll check back in when we'll regroup. These are, oh, I should say, it's not on that sheet. Those are the pre-circulated examples. In case people hadn't done the homework, I brought them to be in front of you. These, all the other examples, I've included the journal and the year, not the author's name. And of course, if we know who the authors are, it's not to be taken personally, because as we say, these did make it to publication stage. But in case you're interested about like the specificity or specialization of the journal, that's why I indicated that much. Otherwise, they're anonymized. And I was not to like fully advertise other people's writing that we were working on improving. Okay? Okay, I'll go back to this one. What do people come up with as a revision? It's the first, the context, partly the reason I gave you the articles so that you have the context is clear. It's the first sentence of the abstract.
Too long.
Too long? So do you shorten it, presumably?
Yeah, I don't think it's shortened, but yeah, I wrote it like in label-free quantitative shotgun liquid chromatography-tandem experiment. A series of computational steps is required for the detection, identification, and quantification of differentially abundant proteins. In parentheses, this good matrix.
What was in parentheses?
The LCMS features.
Ah. Do you want to read that one more time, just a little slower for everyone? It sounded good. You started off in label-free.
In label-free quantitative shotgun liquid chromatography-tandem mass spec experiments, comma, a series of computational steps is required for the detection, identification, and quantification of differential abundant proteins, in brackets, LCMS features.
All right, very nice. I like that. Saying in this area, it's a nice, you're saying in, it's called the prepositional phrase, but you're really inviting people in. This is the field that we'll be talking about. It's general enough, but you're taking them into the paper through the field. So I like that. Go ahead. Or was that a hand? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess like we were talking about how like you could maybe like say instead of just like this is a series of steps, which is like really general, you could like go to like a more salient point about the article as a whole, which is that this like the series of steps is actually like there's like a lot of hyperparameters. And that's the point of the article that like users can tweak and get like really different results. It's not just a series of steps; it's like complex and very tunable depending on the user. So I think that would lead into like the other parts of the abstract better. I didn't like write a rewording, but I think saying instead of like saying a series of steps, you'd say it's a particularly complex series of steps, or there's a lot of different strategies you can take, or something like that.
Did anyone else share, I think, Albert's version of sense of revision. Go ahead.
Series of computational steps identifying and quantifying liquid chromatography mass spectrometry in paralysis LCMS. Features are required to detect the differentially expressed proteins from label-free quantitative shotgun LCMS MS experiments. It's like I'm trying. So the sentence actually says that you need computational methods or steps to identify the features. So I started off with saying that these are required for identifying the features.
Interesting. Did other people take up that version of editing? We'll talk about this principle later, but it sounds like you're trying to balance the fact that you want to stress the computational steps that lead to the identification and quantification. There's stress when readers like stress both the beginning and ends of sentences, and the middle can get a little bit lost, just in the way that readers read. So think about where you place that key information, which we'll talk about more later. Anyone else? What do you think, Nina? Well, we shouldn't always ask you because we have a number of examples, so we don't want to make it.
To hear it.
Okay, I really like these edits. I think they would. If I was an editor and I had options, I would choose some of these over the one that I ended up with, which we'll get to after taking a little tour through this first principle, or I should say this first rule of the first principle. The reason this term, characterization, is underlined, bolded, colored, highlighted, you'll see detection here and characterization here. They're both the subject of the sentence. Here's another example. This is from another abstract where this particular kind of word was really, really prevalent. Quantification, it's the subject in the first sentence. Detection is not the subject, again, but it's another kind of word like this. Peptide quantification is the subject here. And then again, detection. These kinds of words are really, really common in chemistry. They have a name. Here's a few other versions, although they're used as adjectives. Data analysis step. Tell me if I ever go too far into grammar, but adjectives, subjects, verbs, I'm going to assume that we're kind of on the same page. And feature detection, so used as an adjective to describe approach. Here's the first change. I'm just noticing this is the next word of the abstract to a different kind of subject. We, the group, the first person, plural, we, developed a new feature detection algorithm. So just mark that change. We go through several sentences of this word. We're on our first principle. Please forgive my American sports reference. Right, Giannis, I'm a bandwagon kind of fan, and he's been with the Bucks in Boston in the last week, but now they're back in Milwaukee. Is anybody following? No? Don't worry about it. But partly, this is again like not to be a motivational speaker if you're not feeling so motivated about writing, but anytime I'm thinking about improving, just draw on someone as inspiring as Giannis Antetokounmpo. It was a very inspiring story. You can read about it in the New York Times, not just on ESPN, according to what you read about. Okay, so this is the first principle. This is why I ask people to know subjects and verbs. Keep track of your subjects and the action words that attach to them. The first rule under this principle is to avoid nominalizations. I would go, as an editor, I would try, although they're very common in chemistry, to revise most of my nominalizations, and try to revise definitely most of them when they're in the subject position of the sentence. So as in detection and peptide quantification leading off as the subject of the sentence. This is a person who's written a book called Writing for Science, Robert Goldbort. He has a term for replacing nominalizations. Keep characters in mind. You don't always have to use the first person, I or we, but some kind of recognizable agent, something that can complete an action or perform an action. Nominalizations are words that make other kinds of words, like verbs or action words, into nouns. So, for example, to characterize would become characterization, to identify becomes identification, to quantify becomes quantification, to analyze becomes analysis, but that one doesn't sound as much of a mouthful as some of the other ones. Trying to think of other common ones. To detect becomes detection. These are really, really common. Are they reading about it? You see them a lot in the literature. But part of what I'm saying when I say that a sentence level edit can help you be a more dynamic, active storyteller of a scientific writer, when you use a nominalization, the action has already been completed. It's done. So that's why it's now in a noun state. It's like a thing. So it's made a little bit more inert or less active than when the word can be used in its verb form. Does this make sense to everybody? Yes? Okay. Stop me again if it doesn't make sense. But go ahead.
What do you think is the benefit of avoiding nominalization? Is it more concise? Is it just that simple?
It's often more concise, partly because you often have to use a preposition after, like detection of peptides or identification of peptides or matches or whatever. But it's more that the action has already been taken away from the word, and therefore it feels more static and less dynamic as a kind of prose style. Also, when it's in the subject position, it's just harder for a reader to understand what's happening. Like this example, it's just a lot to take in. This is the kind of abstract where you would reread sentences more than one time. The easier subject you have going into the sentence, the more easy it is for your reader to stay with you. So I wouldn't say avoid all nominalizations. They're better off later on in the sentence after the reader is already following your thought process. But leading off with them is difficult for a reader. Does that make sense? So here's a good example, or here's what I'm talking about when I think why I would change it. Because the action has already happened, the verb becomes what we call a to-be verb, rather than an action word. To-be verbs are states of being, rather than actions. So there's active verbs, and there's to-be verbs. I would change it. Did anybody change this one? Did anybody take the time? Or take the time you had to work on this one? What did people come up with? Go ahead.
So I had two ways on this one. The first one was when we use some acronyms, I think that it's a good idea to have the initials in caps. In this case, I, T, and P. Intrinsically disordered proteins. So that the theoretical things, although it's obvious, but still just to let the reader know if it is in the middle of a long sentence, then what is this acronym standing for? So those three initials in caps.
But you're saying that's a good thing about the sentence.
No, in that words also. Intrinsically the I and the intrinsically the T. So
I think an editor will change that.
So that it's emphasized that the IDP is for that.
Right. I see what you're saying. Like you're saying capital I intrinsically, capital D disordered. But I do think the editor will change it back into this version because this is the standard version. To just have the capital letters in the acronym that follows in the parentheses. That's just my guess. You might try it. You might try submitting it like that. But my understanding is that it's more standard to keep the lowercase when it's spelled out fully.
Right. Sometimes the reason is because sometimes the acronyms are not one-to-one mapping. In this case, it's one-to-one mapping. But sometimes there are more acronyms than the words. Sometimes there are more words, but the acronym is less number of letters.
Right.
So that's why. In this case, it's 3 words and 3 acronym letters. So yeah.
Interesting.
So that was the first one, and the second one was the second last sentence. In the field of protein science, due to limited capabilities, I wrote in obtaining full-length high-resolution structures rather than to obtain.
Right. So rather than in the field of protein science, due to limited capabilities to obtain,
I wrote in obtaining.
in obtaining. Yes, I believe I did as well, because the to obtain, it doesn't attach itself well to limited capability, or sorry, due to limited capabilities in obtaining versus to obtain. Yeah, to obtain sounds like you're talking about the person who cannot obtain it, but that person is kind of evaporated off, and we just have the capabilities instead. Did anybody else revise the sentence? Oh, go ahead. And then
I revised to obtaining full-length high-resolution structures of intrinsically disordered proteins has been a major challenge. It felt to me like it was saying it's hard to characterize the structure because it's hard to get the structure as I read this, so I thought I would just chop it off. Unless there's something about the disordered protein high resolutions. I mean, there is, but it's not maybe, I don't know. Maybe there was more information that needed to follow up in that sentence.
Go ahead.
So I focused on what the actual problem is. So I started with a major challenge in the field of protein. Yeah, a major challenge in the field of protein science is the structural characterization of intrinsically IDPs. So I just focused on the problem. And then I wrote this after appearing. This is due to the limited capability.
So not unlike your change where you cut it off to make it more obvious, like this is the challenge, and then build from there. Interesting. You could be quite punchy and just say what you said when there was a kind of like rhetorical repetition of this is the challenge because this is the challenge. That would be interesting, but rarely seen, I would say. Well, I mean, keeping in mind this principle of subject and action, I think these changes are good because it reminds me of what Albert is saying. Like sometimes this is just longer than it needs to be as a way in. But I would say I would think about replacing the verb with an active verb. So not is, the challenge isn't something, but the field has struggled with something. It's more dramatic, so I'm not sure if people will take it, but what do you think of the more active verb version? Go ahead.
So I feel the word hamstrung is loaded there.
Loaded?
Yeah, in the sense of as a vocabulary.
Yeah, in the sense that it's like too dramatic.
Difficult vocabulary.
Difficult.
Help simplify.
You could also say handicapped, but that's also a bit of a loaded word, I would say. But I take your point.
Now it is more convoluted.
Yes, more convoluted because of the dash structure in the middle. And it sounds like both of you would just have taken out that the field of protein science has long struggled to characterize the structure and gotten rid of the extra stuff in the middle. That's also a good option. What do you think, Kylie? Is it, you have a look of inner conflict?
Oh, no. I'm just thinking about it.
Is it too much? It sounds like it might be.
I would remove the field of protein science and probably put it as a full-length high-resolution protein structures. That way I'm kind of excluding protein science. I mean, it's obvious that when you're talking about protein structures, it is protein science. So.
I mean, that's something that has come up in the previous abstract as well. What is so obvious to your audience that doesn't need to be said? And what could be said anyway, just as a reminder, like a friendly reminder. The first sentence of an abstract is often the place for that general concept to be stated, even if you assume your readers are familiar with it. Because if you think of the slightly broader audience outside your expected readership, they might need the reminder, as long as you don't spend too long on it. I don't think it's unwelcome at the beginning of an abstract. My point here, though, is mainly to think about finding a different, more simple subject, like field of protein science, and a more active verb. So rather than has been, but something, like has confronted, or has, needs to address, or whatever it may be. Something that actually carries a kind of an action with it. Does everybody follow that logic? Okay. This is the big abstract. This was the original version. And I'm just highlighting again here that these nominalizations, quantification, detection, they often take to be verbs. So is, are, would be. This sentence here, about halfway through the abstract, in fact, because this is only the first half, is the first time you see a simple subject like we, and an active verb like developed, we developed. So there's a rhetorical effect to making that turn into like what this group and this paper has done, away from this sort of general picture of the problem that they're describing. But I would say this is a case where the whole abstract would be better if there were fewer nominalizations and fewer to-be verbs, or that's the argument that I would try and make. So I changed it to something like quantitative proteomics relies on the label-free quantification of shotgun LC-MS, tandem MS data. This approach remains computationally non-trivial. This, I think, is the hardest one. Scientists typically quantify peptides by associating signal intensities and peptide specifics. I felt that this is maybe the almost too general kind of information for an abstract. So, for example, when you want like a human agent kind of subject of your sentence, like scientists or researchers, but what you go on to describe them doing is something that you could take for granted, that's when I would think about maybe editing out the entire sentence. But here I'm trying to make the point that whatever it is, you want a simpler subject and a sort of sharper active verb. Does that make sense? Okay. So I said this was half of the abstract. This is the other half. And just keep in mind, these are published papers, so the editor agreed to publish an abstract of this length. You'll see the we sentence we developed, so that's where we stopped, just here. And here is the second half. In fact, this we kicks off a sort of pattern where there's much more sort of personal pronoun. Our software, this approach, our approach, we validated. So moves from a very sort of abstract subject to the sentences that aren't people or aren't things to this group occupying a lot of subject positions. This is the case where looking at it is kind of difficult, where if you were to characterize what's ineffective science writing and when it's hard for the reader, if it's hard to even just kind of like take in, that's kind of a sign that it's too hard. So that's why I probably would have just taken out, this is like the much shorter version. It still creates a long abstract, but we could follow some of the guidelines of what you were saying and just remove a good amount of it. And even I, as a non-scientist, thought that I could find stuff to remove. Where typically, as an editor, I would leave most of it, you know, because I'm not on the bench, but rather just editing the language. Any questions about this nominalization issue? Okay, so as I said just now, I don't usually make too many edits to the content. Therefore, and I thought this sentence was good and these papers were good, so I made the most minimal change. Although I very much liked that in label-free, in label-free quantitative or shotgun, I liked that version of starting off quite a bit. If you're stuck with a nominalization that just feels kind of heavy, and the prose starts to feel kind of heavy and therefore difficult for readers to get through, sometimes the fastest change is just to change it to an ing word. In this case, it's called a gerund, detecting differentially abundant proteins. The ing obviously implies like some kind of ongoing activity, and hence is slightly more active than detection of. That's why I gave you, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, you were saying something.
No, go ahead.
So what I felt in this sentence, not in this one, like the original one, and the whole thing is that the subject and the predicate, the proportion of it is the balance between that is somehow off, in the sense that if you see starting from detecting up to experiments, the whole thing is the subject.
Yes.
The rest of the thing.
Right.
It's like loaded on one side rather than the predicate. So I don't know whether, as a writing expert, how do you see that part, that the subject is 3 lines and the predicate is 1 line?
So we will talk about that quite a bit, actually. I think that's what's coming up exactly next. But what you're saying, this is technically called, so the subject, the head subject is detection or detecting, but it's actually a part of a larger noun phrase, which involves all these words, detecting differentially abundant proteins in label-free quantitative, shotgun liquid chromatography-tandem spectrometry. Requires, it doesn't come to right here.
Until experiments,
Yes. Let's go on to do that, I would say. We have time to do the second example before the break, and that is an issue that will come up. But good to already be thinking about it. And when you say predicate, everyone understands that predicate is actually the more specific version for verb. A verb is any action word, but when it's attached to a subject in a sentence, we say predicate. Just in case. Okay, excellent. Not coming up next, but after this one. Here's the second example on your sheet. So take as many minutes as you need. This is another sort of really common issue that an editor would often address or catch. But you may have other changes beyond what I'm thinking about as well. I've seen quite a few great changes already, so we'll have, please do share, but anyone else on how they edited this sentence from the study design section? Go ahead.
I have two sentences. The first one is to accurately detect differentially abundant proteins, comma, a comprehensive and fully documented workflow is proposed. Stop. This development involved reprocessing the raw data after the study conclusion using the latest version of Skyline.
All right, excellent. Two sentences. Can you read the first one more time?
To accurately detect differentially abundant proteins, comma, a comprehensive and fully documented workflow is proposed.
Okay. We'll come back to that first sentence, but I very much like the impulse for two sentences. I saw at least one other version of that. Did many people make it into two sentences? Go ahead and read our other version of two sentences.
So I wrote as at the end of the study, the raw data were reprocessed by the IPRG group using the most recent version of Skyline. This would provide a comprehensive and fully documented workflow exemplifying the accurate detection of differentially abundant proteins.
Okay, did everyone hear those two sentences? Or do you want to read them one more time? So, just a little slowly?
So, at the end of the study, the raw data were reprocessed by the IPRG group using the most recent version of Skyline, in parentheses, the version number. This would provide a comprehensive and fully documented workflow exemplifying the accurate detection of differentially abundant proteins.
Okay, very good. Nice sequence moving from what happened to why it matters. Go ahead.
The IPRG group reprocessed the raw data after concluding the study with the most recent version of Skyline in order to provide a comprehensive and fully documented workflow that exemplified the accurate detection of differentially abundant proteins.
Did everybody hear the difference between the first two revisions and this revision? Did anybody hear happen to catch the difference? Go ahead.
Switch the order of the sentence.
The order of the subject and verb gets switched around. Anybody else want to share their take or go?
Mine was almost identical to his.
So also two sentences.
No, one sentence.
Oh,
Almost
this
identical.
just now. Excellent. I think I was thinking along the same lines as these later two. Again, just because this is part of the subject action sort of principle, like thinking about the subject and the verb. But I'll show you that this is something an editor might catch anyway, beyond splitting it up into two sentences, because it's part of a pattern of error that's really quite common. So it's not surprising to see it in published literature, because it happens all the time. And it doesn't necessarily impede meaning, but it's grammatically incorrect. So here's another example. To test our hypothesis, tryptic peptides, etc., were analyzed via polarity switching, etc. This is called a dangling modifier. Does anyone remember? I said we would get a little more granular than subject-verb, but think about like the basic principle of what is doing what or who is doing what in the sentence. Here's the modifier, and here's the subject that gets modified, tryptic peptides. Can tryptic peptides test a hypothesis? I don't think so. So this is when you lead off with like a to phrase, like in order to do something or to perform this, and follow it with a passive construction, you are at risk for creating a dangling modifier. And again, it's so common. Like, we understand what is happening in both of these sentences. We understand, like, that it's the scientists that have this intention to provide a comprehensive and fully documented study or to test their hypothesis. And then this is what gets done to test the hypothesis. So it's really being, it's like somewhat very principled and virtuous as a grammarian to always go back and edit this error. But it does, you know, we have a sort of ambitious level of good, clear, effective writing. So that's what we're striving for. Here's another example. By comparing samples with short electrospray pulses rather than constant electrospray, the performance is normalized. It's the same problem. And then in this case, does everyone understand the grammatical issue here? So this is what I came up with, but I very much liked the double version sentences. Whatever, I would probably put it in active voice, so the IPRG group reprocessed. But I very much take the revisions that shorten this first part, and so don't delay the sentence to getting to the subject. The RPG group reprocessed the raw data. However, there are times when you might want to keep the passive voice, and in that scenario, you need to go back and edit the original phrase so that you can keep the passive voice. For example, because the study aimed to provide a comprehensive and fully documented workflow that exemplifies accurate detection. Even as I read that, it's quite long, but it's not grammatically incorrect. The raw data will be processed.
I think recent version and today is internet.
Yes, thank you for catching that. We don't need to say recent version and most recent version and to date.
So,
I don't think. Yeah.
what about just writing that with the latest Skyline version 3.5?
Yeah, you could say.
With the latest version of Skyline and within parentheses v 3.5.
I mean, I don't hear a difference between latest and most recent. I think you could use either.
So it's a saving of one word.
Yeah, you say one word. Yeah, if you're at the edge of a word count, then good change. Okay, does everybody see the principle behind the change? Partly, the issue is about passive voice. Is everybody familiar with passive voice or remembering the moment when you learned about passive versus active voice? I find that many, a graduate student and undergraduate, has a vague memory but doesn't necessarily know how to describe them or define them on command, at least. These are all passive constructions. Were analyzed, is normalized, are compared, were reprocessed. Does that sound familiar? Okay, it's again very common, and there's a time and a place for it. So you'll see it especially in method sections and experimental sections. So this is again an issue for subject and action. I would say that on the whole, you want to use active voice. Again, because you'll often be told to write clearly and concisely. It's more clear and it's more concise because you, for example, avoid dangling modifiers. It's clear what subject performs what action. And it's more dynamic and active, and therefore a little easier for readers to follow and engaging for a reading audience. That's on the whole, that's in general. But there are, of course, times when you would use the passive voice. So it's not a blanket ban on the passive voice. But you would want to know where to use it, and you don't want to fall into using it unconsciously just because you see it out there in the literature. It's very much a question of many papers will use it across the paper. And therefore, I sometimes actually encounter resistance among graduate students, and my chemistry graduate students in particular, to changing the passive voice because it sounds like the articles they read, and therefore they want to write like the articles they read. But in fact, it's a long, ongoing debate. Here's the definition. In passive voice, the subject receives the action. This is why I say watch out for to be verbs. You cannot write a passive construction without using one of these verbs. Is, are, am, was, were, be, being, been. A passive construction requires a to be verb. In active voice, the subject performs the action. it's a long, long debate. It goes back to 1957 at least, where the editorial board commented to their authors that their primary objection to using the passive voice was the frequency with which dangling modifiers showed up in the articles, which is a pretty minimal qualm to have. You know, that was their major issue. They commented on the debate, which was ongoing even then, about passive voice, which has to do with subjectivity. Does subjectivity get invited into the article if you always change your subjects to I or we or our group? That's one reason sometimes people like to avoid the passive. But this is the issue we just looked at, dangling modifiers. And that was the qualm of the editorial board, at least in 1957. And yet you still see it. All these examples are from the 2010s. So it persists as an issue. This, I would say the stakes of the debate have changed a little bit. Has anybody heard of the subjectivity issue or had that conversation? You know, if I use active voice and to say we approached the problem this way, or we hypothesized that, or we took this method. Has anybody heard of this? You know, what's that? What would be the problem with doing that beyond grammatical issues? Is this subjectivity issue about active voice versus passive voice new to you? New?
I've discussed it, but I don't have a clear decision on, or clear opinion on what.
But it's been discussed. But still up in the air in a way. Go ahead.
When I wrote my first biology report, I was told that do not use I and we and always use passive voice, and I don't really know why.
Yeah, I mean, I think certain journals will say that they prefer it. I think there's smoother versions of the passive than these kinds of like word reprocessed, where you might say the authors or the paper or the manuscript. That I think is a nice like intermediate version of active voice, like where you refer to your group in some way, or the fact that you're writing the manuscript, but you're not using I and we. I would say that's a nice way to do it. The authors sounds a little awkward to me, but you'll see it out there. The authors suggest that, meaning me, the person writing, or me and my groups of people writing. And that can sound, it can give you a chance to use an active verb if you're, you know, like looking to be more concise or more active. The other side of the coin of subjectivity, though, is the responsibility aspect of the debate, where you, in fact, are doing the research, and on some level you don't want to anonymize yourself to the extent that you suggest that it's not like that a group of scientists is actually performing it and designing, like understanding the problem, designing the method to address the problem, executing the method. So there's, I think the debate shifted from a focus on subjectivity, where should we let I and we in the first person, to should we let I and we in because it suggests that we're taking responsibility for the way the study ran or the way the research went. Go ahead and then here, Kylie, and then your name is.
Yeah. So one thing I notice often is there's definitely people definitely have strong opinions on whether to use I or we or not in scientific writing. But something I also notice is that people tend to get so used to writing in a passive voice to specifically avoid I or we that they continue writing in a passive voice, even for sentences where you wouldn't use I or we and can be written actively even without those. So, for example, the image data was segmented by our new method, when you could just as easily say our method segmented the image data or something like that. Just out of habit.
Or even more so, like the data shows is totally fine to say. You don't need to say whatever it is shown in the data. Go ahead.
When I write, we say like instead of saying we hypothesize, it's like the present study hypothesized. the
Mhm.
current study hypothesized. Is that a, because since you asked like can a study hypothesize? Or,
Right. No, I would say we. I mean,
because my advisor doesn't agree with the term using we, I, or quantify.
neither.
Yeah. So it's either use the current study or the present study hypothesize or examine or.
Ah, I see.
So
I mean,
he says like we or I come only when you're speaking. So if it's giving a presentation,
Right.
we can use the term we studied or our group studied, but when it's coming from different media, it should be like we don't emphasize on we or I, because if we say we means all the authors have been in, but they might not have contributed to the study at all. They must have just done the analysis of something like that, but it shouldn't. So it should be like the study examined or the study hypothesized.
yeah, I take your point that it's not. I mean, everyone will understand what you mean when you say the study hypothesizes.
Yes.
But it's not literally true that a study can hypothesize
Right, yeah,
something. It's like the hypothesis is in this study, or the hypothesis guides the study. You might say the guiding hypothesis of this study theorizes, proposes, suggests, and then you can have it both ways. But I take your point.
Basically, it should be as minimal word as possible because human mind just drifts off.
Yeah.
So it should be as to the point. And
Right.
That's what he said. He said like 8 words in a sentence is not more than that. Anything more than that, your mind will drift off and you won't recollect what happened.
I've never heard such a low quota as 8 words. But I do agree that you should err towards short sentences, which we'll also get to. Has anybody else been really told no I? I mean, I is quite common to be told no I, but even no we. So no first person. I is singular first person, we is plural first person. When you're reading a paper that doesn't ever turn to active voice, I think the experience is more difficult as a reader for this very reason. That it's easier when the subjects are simpler. But I would say even our study, our method, the method, you can scientize it a little bit, but I wouldn't always put things in passive. We'll look at an example to show that. There is a place for passive voice, of course, especially in methods and experimental sections. And that's because those sections are suggesting that the way you did the experiment is iterable across labs. So you very much do want to downplay your subjectivity and your role in how the experiment worked out. So that is the place where you'll see it most commonly. Although this is also perfectly good. Although a lot of method development in proteomics has already been devoted to QC, you sometimes see it in a literature review kind of citation. This has been studied in this way. That's also kind of common. This is the responsibility issue that I'm talking about. And I used to only have an example of Chris Christie. If you don't know who Chris Christie is, I said I was coming from Rutgers. I was there during Bridgegate in 2014. I believe actually a woman just went to jail. She said her piece and then she went to jail for it just last month, April. If you don't know what Bridgegate is, it was a political scandal. But mistakes were made during that moment. And to be fair to both Chris Christie and Joe Biden, who is next, there was active voice around this. I think he said, we disappointed our citizens or something after that. But it just goes to show how even one slip into the passive voice in the wrong moment can carry unfortunate effects about responsibility. And can, in fact, with Biden, I'm not to be political, only to make the point that this really matters. And it's nice to have a sort of bipartisan example rather than just Chris Christie. I'm sorry she was treated the way she was treated. This, again, is followed by some active voice. I wish we could have given her the trial she deserved or whatever. This is in reference to Anita Hill's testimony against the nomination of Clarence Thomas way back when. But because Biden is running, he's being asked about it, and this was his answer. I'm sorry she was treated the way she was treated. Does everyone see the passive? Okay, so that's the issue of responsibility. Here's the issue of getting through reading the passive voice. This is not from a science, this is not from a chemistry article, but from an aeronautical engineering article that I encountered recently. So when I said that I sometimes encounter conflict or confrontation over active versus passive voice from graduate students. This was an aeronautical engineer who submitted this abstract as a model publication, as in, I like the writing in this publication, not just the content or the science in it. And I thought, gosh. It's hard to get through. Just to take, for example, the first sentence, the stationary probability structure for the areoelastic response of a structurally nonlinear flooding airfoil subject to random turbulent flow is examined numerically. That's very much the issue of the distance between subject and verb, which we'll talk about later. And then we could skip ahead, for example, to the last couple sentences where usually in an abstract, that's where you're going to kind of land the highlight takeaway of your results. You're going to describe the takeaway from your results. More generally, it is found that the random excitation effectively decouples the nonlinear responses, such as the pitch rate, heave, and heave rate, marginal PDFs transition from unit to bimodality at different air speeds. It is argued that a fundamental cause of the observed behavior is the synergy between the nonlinear and the random external excitation. Do you have a good sense of what the paper is going to argue? I mean, this is the job of the abstract, to tell you what this paper is all about and why it matters. Do you walk away with a sense of what that might be? No? Go ahead, Albert.
Well, I think yes, because it is like the last sentence and you highlighted it. But otherwise, if I was just like reading, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, go ahead, Patty.
It's especially interesting to me that, because I think it's clear from this abstract that when they say it is argued that, what they're really saying is we are arguing this, but there are lots of situations where I would write, it is argued that because other people are arguing it, and then I'm going to say something else. So it is argued that this is okay, but I'm going to say that it's not. So it's funny because they're using that construction totally differently than I might use it in certain situations.
Precisely. That's a very common construction. You know, it is well known that, it has been argued that, it has been shown that, we show, or this paper shows, as this sort of term. It's very, this is why this follows the responsibility slide, because it's very difficult to tell who is doing the arguing or the finding given the abstract. Exhibits is the only active verb in the abstract. And it turns out that this article is not the people arguing that a fundamental cause of the observed behavior is the synergy between the nonlinear and the random external citation. But you wouldn't know. You wouldn't really know who it, you would assume that it's this paper because of the last, it's falling in this place, the last sentence of the abstract. But in fact, that's not even the case. It does make me want to throw up my hands as well. But this is the cautionary tale for justify your use of the passive voice, but don't just use passive voice. Or as Kylie said before, don't fall into using passive voice just because. Because ultimately, you'll run the risk of making it unclear who, in fact, is doing what in your study. Even if you don't need to say we, you could say the method employed, the paper. You could find a slightly more anonymous version. Go ahead.
So since you use the term observed behavior, it means it is in the study, right? The last line.
The last line. It is argued that the fundamental cause of the observed behavior is a synergy. Yeah, but that's like...
It is in this current study only, right? The one they are talking about.
I think what's happening is they're talking about a study that observes that behavior. But you're making me, you know, observed behavior is an interesting kind of passive construction as well in a way. You can think of it more as like a review, although I don't think it was classed as a review, but they're reviewing this argument and these observations and these findings.
The first line states they did an experiment, right? Examined the
Yeah.
And then the second one would
Is examined numerically.
So I think they did the study.
Well, when you say probabilistic engineering mechanics, I think what they're doing is people have done this research. Probabilistic engineering mechanics, as far as I understand it, takes other people's data, right? Yeah, yeah. So they're examining it numerically, but this is the behavior that they're observing.
Yeah, so they are observing that behavior, right?
No, The other group is observing that behavior. They're examining that behavior numerically.
Okay.
Part of it has to do with access to the actual data. Like if you don't have access via the FAA, it can be actually hard to get data done yourself. Go ahead.
So going back to the last sentence there, observed behavior. So what do you think of this form? It is argued that a fundamental cause of the behavior observed swinging the order. Which one?
I mean, the term itself, observed behavior, doesn't bother me so much, but it would be clearer if the subject was clearer and the verb was an active verb. So like this paper argues that a fundamental cause, or the paper under review argues that a fundamental cause of the behavior observed or the observed behavior.
So which one? My question was really on that one.
I think that if the rest of the context was clear, the phrase observed behavior is totally fine. This paper reviews the argument that a fundamental cause of behavior observed under these conditions, maybe a behavior observed and then a little more information.
Followed by something else.
Yeah, like under these conditions, something or
Or
other.
if there is nothing else, then observed behavior.
Yeah.
Using the observed as a past participle adjective.
Right, past participle, observed. So partly I would suggest for people who are trying to get better at writing is, of course, this is just like the little pre-break moment memo, is of course to read the literature in your field, but also read slightly adjacent to it. You'll discover, because if you're not reading purely for content and just for the way they structure their sentences, you'll learn a little bit more about how you find it best as a reader, as a writer for your readers. Go ahead.
So, do we use the past tense, right? In some case, do we use was or not, where?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think typically you use if you found a result, if you have a result, like something resulted, that's past tense. But when you're describing how the results matter, they continue to matter.
So, like in the first line, it should be was examined or it is examined?
I mean, really either would be okay if the subject of doing the examining would be clearer. Is examined in this paper, was examined in this paper. Certain journals will tend to use one more than the other in these kinds of situations, but either would be fine if the subject was clearer. So I suppose the message for here is that the subject should be clear and simple. Okay? Shall we have a break? Yes. We'll meet back in 30 minutes.